Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the Research Workplan. My name is Maitha Almazrouei, and I'm one of the members of Emirates Collaboration of Residents in Emergency Medicine, also known as ECREM. So as we approach the end of our roadmap, we have completed so far 6 out of 8 modules successfully, hoping that you guys have benefited from most of them. We have tried to highlight the most important and basic topics in order to be able to create an easy pathway for you guys and to have a solid background when coming to start any research paper. Today we are reaching our 7th module of the Research Workplan, and that will be presented by Dr. Mansoor and Dr. Suneel. But first, let me introduce to you my co-host of the day, Dr. Nada. Welcome, Nada.
Thanks, Maitha. Hey guys, Assalamu alaikum. This is Nada and Saeed. I'm one of the ECREM board members and the social media coordinator. I hope you're all doing well, and I'm delighted to be one of the moderators for today's session.
Thank you so much. So to remind you, the Research Workplan is actually designed as a modular series of lectures that all together create a roadmap conducting a scientific research with content tailored toward EM residents in the UAE, but also generalizable to all national and international physicians, residents, medical students, and interns who are interested in navigating research from concept to reality.
As you may have read from our brochures, this initiative is made possible thanks to the collaboration with the team over at BEEM, which is Best Evidence in Emergency Medicine. BEEM is an international emergency medicine knowledge translation program created by EM physicians for EM practitioners, and it has the mission and vision of being the most valid, reliable, and unbiased global source of current, clinically relevant, patient-centered evidence for EM physicians, and to provide the best clinical evidence for optimization of patient care. We are incredibly grateful and proud to host some amazing physician researchers from both UAE and Canada who have put forth an invaluable effort to produce the content within this series.
Hey everyone, this is Anzar Rahman, your technical host for the EBM module and just the person behind the scenes today. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted on the ECREM website for you to access at any time. To minimize background noise, your mics will be muted, but we encourage you to use the chat box and type in any questions you may have for the speakers and the moderators, who will get back to these at the end of the session Q&A. Finally, if you have any technical issues, please send me a private message in the chat box and we will try to get that sorted out for you as quickly as we can. Hope you all have a very productive and educational session.
Thanks, Anzal. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Mansoor Husain. Dr. Mansoor graduated from Imperial College School of Medicine in London in 2005 with an MBBS and a Bachelor of Science with honors in Healthcare Science and Management. He completed his postgraduate training in London, and after initially dabbling in surgery, he completed his EM training in 2014. He worked for 5 years as a consultant in emergency medicine at St. George's Hospital, which is a large trauma center, tertiary and teaching hospital, and medical school in the south of London. At St. George's, he was the Royal College of Emergency Medicine site tutor, and he was the lead for medical education in the department with 60 junior doctors in training. He now works as a consultant at Tawam Hospital in Ain, and he's one of the core faculty for the EM residency program. His main interests are medical education, trauma and resuscitation medicine, and airway and sedation skills. So we're going to start with his lecture now.
Assalamu alaikum, good evening. My name is Mansoor Husain. Thank you very much to the ECREM team for inviting me back for another talk on your evidence-based medicine Grand Rounds program. We're going to be looking at some tips for good writing. Hopefully this will slot in nicely with the rest of the program so far, and we'll just cover a few things, few tips and tricks for writing good scientific papers, research papers, medical articles, and also for just generally good good writing in general. I hope it will help you in other parts of your life as well. I have nothing to declare. I have no conflicts of interest when it comes to the evidence-based Grand Round kind of program, and this talk doesn't have any products or any endorsements attached to it. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk briefly about kind of where you start, what you need to do in order to write a paper. I'm not going to go into too much detail in this because this has obviously been covered in the rest of the program. And talk about what order you need to write the paper in and how you're supposed to, where should you start writing the paper, where should you end writing the paper. Covering just a little bit about what I think are the most important parts of your paper and how when you're submitting it to a journal. We'll try and limit it to 20 kind of tips for good writing. Otherwise, this talk can go on for hours and hours. And on that note, we're not going to be covering how to write an introduction, how to write a methods, how to write a results and kind of statistical analysis section, because all of those things, you can talk for a long time about them. I will, however, at the end, give you some links on where you can get a lot more information about these. One is a very long kind of YouTube video, and another one's a very nice kind of presentation going into much more detail about what you need to do in each individual section and the kind of things you need to look at. So there's a quote here which basically says, "It's easier to embalm the dead than to write an article about it." This is from a book on how to write academic research by Paul Sylvia. Essentially, the point he's trying to make is, if you think about how the ancient Egyptians used to embalm their dead, it was a long drawn out process. It involved many steps. It involved a lot of different processes, and it took a long time. But his point is, it's actually easier to do that than it is to write an article about how to do it. Same thing with medical research. It takes a long time, and it takes a lot of planning, and even if you're doing a case report, it takes a lot of time to go through all the steps to get to the point where you can even start writing. However, it actually sometimes seems easier to do those steps than it is to actually write down what you did and describe what you did and put it together clearly and concisely. So it's just something to note that actually once you've done everything, actually writing the article can often be the hardest step to take. So what defines a good paper? I think in 3 bullet points, this is all you really need to kind of cover. A good paper has a clear message, a useful message, and a significant message. As long as you can keep those things in mind, then you can write a good paper. You have to construct your paper clearly. You have to present all of your evidence and all of your kind of messages in a very logical manner so that people can understand what you're trying to say. And the significance of what you're doing has to be easily grasped by reviewers, by editors, and by the readers. You submit your paper to a journal. It's sent to a reviewer, a couple of reviewers, a panel of reviewers. Then they're going to get hundreds of papers to read. And this is something they do in their spare time. They may not necessarily be paid to do it. They may not necessarily be interested in your subject matter, but you need to get them on board if your paper is going to then progress to the editor for review and then be published. Once the reviewers have gone through it, the editors need to kind of read it and kind of say, yep, okay, we'll publish this paper. And then it's going to be published. And then you need to get the same thing, same level of involvement with the readers of the paper. They need to understand it. They need to get the message you're trying to put across. Otherwise, it'll never be a good paper. So before you start, obviously this has been covered during the rest of this Grand Round program, so I'm not going to go into too much into this at all, but essentially pick a good topic, pick something that interests you, pick a topic that is useful to others and has some unanswered questions which you're hoping to answer. Then you have to determine how you're going to answer it. Are you going to do some quantitative research? Are you going to do qualitative research? Are you going to do a synthesis paper? Are you going to basically do a literature review? Are you going to do a review article, a systematic review? Are you going to bring together other research that people have looked at and present that? Are you going to write a case report? Are you going to write a medical article? There's a number of ways that you can get yourself published, and there's a number of ways you may want to look at, but you need to decide what you want to do before you start writing. Then discuss your idea, discuss your paper with a more experienced person, as your research guru, your mentor, your attending, your faculty, your senior colleagues, your other colleagues. You need to just discuss what you want to do with them to see, is this a good idea and should we proceed? Now, when it comes to doing research, I did do an ECREM talk on this earlier on in the program, and that was about how to do a literature review and how to do a literature search and look at some research. When you're doing your literature search and your review, you need to keep track of your sources. You need to make sure you have all of the evidence available for that source. So you need to know when you're citing that source in your article, when you're putting your references down at the end, you need to know the author, the article, the title of the book, the journal, who published it, when it was published, volume number, edition, so on and so forth, so that someone else can look up that reference that you've given and find that same article that you're quoting from, or that you're using. You can use a program like EndNote. I've got a quick screenshot about this, which can help you kind of keep track of your sources. Make sure you take detailed quotes as you read. You have your options. You can either paraphrase some information from these articles, or you can take direct quotes from them. And make sure you are sure whether you're using a direct quote or whether you are paraphrasing. You need to be quite clear when you're actually writing your own paper. You've got to make sure you keep all of your notes with the correct source. Make sure that you've got this bit of information from one of your literature search articles. You need to make sure that when you actually cite that article, you're citing the correct article, because you may have 20, maybe 25, 30 articles that you're going to put down as references, and make sure your references are attached to the correct source. You can use your medical librarians, your professors, your attendings, your senior colleagues, or people who have research experience to help you find good resources. And we did cover this earlier on in the ECREM in the ECREM program. So this is just a screenshot from EndNote. EndNote is one of these, it's a good program. It does cost money, but you may be able to access it through your library or through your other learning resources. And it basically allows you to keep a list of your own references electronically, so that you can easily find the correct reference. You can easily find the correct quote within that reference, and you can put your references down. You can just get this to export a reference list for your article at the very end. So it makes it much easier to do the referencing side of your research paper. So when you want to start the writing process, you have to then decide, okay, what kind of article we're going to do, what am I doing the research on? You've done all of your work, and now you want to start writing. You have to pick which journal you're going to be kind of deciding to submit your article to. So this, I would definitely go to your senior colleagues, your research gurus, your mentors, and ask them who are the good places that we can submit this research to, and find a relevant journal. And ideally a journal with as high an impact factor as you can get. Then you have to go to that journal's website and then find out what their author guidance is. And you need to refer to the author guidance when you're writing your paper. And that will give you a whole bunch of information on requirements for submission. And it does vary from journal to journal. So do make sure you read the specific author guidance. It'll give you basic things like what kind of font you need to submit everything in, what kind of spacing, what format of diagrams you need to do. Should they be embedded within your submission, or should they be attached at the end? What formats you need to use, what the layout of your article should be, whether they be on different pages or whether you'll need to have section breaks and so on. How you're going to quote your references, whether you're going to use a Harvard method, Vancouver method. These are the common ones. There are other methods of putting your references at the end. You need to get all of this right. And then a very important thing is the word count. You don't want to be you don't want to be over the word count, because they may immediately reject your paper because it's over the word count. It's an easy way for them to sift through whether they're going to publish publish your paper or not. And then the other thing is you don't want to be significantly under the word count, because you have those words to get your point across. So you should try and use them as much as you can. And then you have to decide what order am I going to write my paper. So we all know the basic order of a medical paper, a scientific paper. You kind of follow this kind of IMRAD system, which is basically you start with an introduction, you talk about your methods, then you go through your results and statistical analysis, then you have a discussion section about your results and going back to your introduction, and then you draw your conclusions, which should again be linked to the introduction. And then finally, you put your acknowledgements in and you put your references in at the end of the paper. And this is the basic order of a paper. But is this the order you should write the paper? I don't think so. A lot of people, and myself included, advocate you should write your methods first. Start here, because this is what you actually did. This is a big chunk of the work that you've done. While it's fresh, while it's there, write your methods out. Once you've done your methods section, do your results section and your statistical analysis, because this is the actual work that you've been doing in the background. Get it all down, get it all clear, get it all neat and concise. After you've done these bits, then go to your discussion and your conclusions. And you may find that your discussion and conclusions, obviously they're based on your methods and your results. You may also find that you've come up with something new for discussion after you've written down your methods and results, after you've done your analysis, which is something you hadn't thought of initially. So I would go and do this section next, then do your conclusion section, and then with your conclusion section you can refer back to your introduction, and that's how you should always do it. So then consider writing your introduction afterwards. You may have thought of what you would do as an introduction, but you may find after you've done your results and conclusions that your introduction changes a little bit. So I would advocate probably doing that last. And then finally, the last bit you should do is your abstract and your title, which you can do once you have the bulk of your paper. Once you've actually written your paper, then you can come up with a nice abstract for it and a nice snappy title. So I would end at that point. What is the most important bit of your paper? You may think methods and results. Yeah, I mean, that's the bulk of the work you're doing. But when you look at other people's research, what are the important bits? The title, it's what draws you in. The authors, yeah, if they're important authors and who they are, and yeah, I mean, it's important to know who the authors are. The abstract, I would argue, is very, very important, because that's what we look at when we're doing quick and dirty searches. You look at the abstract, you basically read the abstract, and you can actually get a lot of information from it. You may not need to read the entire paper just to give you some ideas. So the abstract is absolutely important, and the keywords are absolutely important, because this is how your paper is going to be put up into a medical database and how people are going to search for it. So very, very important to do these things well. They need to be accurate, they need to be informative, and basically for effective indexing and searching, as we've just mentioned. And then for these bits, absolutely get help from your most experienced authors that you can, from the research gurus, from your attendings, from your bosses, and see people who've published a lot, and get experience with them to help get a good title and to do an abstract for you. Briefly, I mean, essentially the next few slides I'm going to cover can be essentially covered by just this slide. You have to remember 3 C's for any good piece of kind of factual writing, and that's clarity. Make sure your paper is clear, make sure it's easy to read, make sure the point you're getting across is actually, or you want to get across, is actually the point you get across. And then conciseness, you make sure your paper is not too long and not too waffly. Make sure it basically gets what you need to get covered, gets the point across in as precise and concise a way as you can. And make sure your paper is correct, make sure your results are correct, make sure your statistical analysis makes sense, make sure the conclusions you draw are correct from those results. So those are the 3 C's. And then you have the don'ts on this side, which is avoiding repetition. Repetition is essentially make sure you're not saying the same thing again and again and again. You only need to say it once, maximum twice. Don't repeat the same paragraphs, don't repeat the same stats, don't repeat the same words too often in your paper. Avoid redundancy. Stop talking about things that don't need to be spoken about. Talk about things that have already been, if they've already been mentioned in 100 other papers, you really don't need to go into any detail in your paper. Don't go into a lot of detail about stuff that's not relevant to the work that you've actually done, even though it may be relevant to how you got to the point to do the work. If it's not relevant for this, for getting your point across, you don't really need to talk about it. Definitely don't exaggerate. When it comes to exaggeration, don't overstate what you've done. No, don't understate what you've done either, but don't overstate what you've done. Let your work speak for yourself. Let your your methods, results, conclusions kind of speak for themselves. Let the reader decide the impact of your work. Don't try and overstate it yourself. And finally, avoid any ambiguity. Don't use terms that are ambiguous. Don't use phrases that can have double meanings or multiple meanings. Make sure what you're trying to say is clear, concise, and correct, as we already mentioned. So now we just come on to some tips for writing. I've tried to make it 20. There's hundreds of tips you can give. And these are in no significant kind of particular order. There is a slight order to them, but just a few things that I've put together when it comes to writing kind of factual or medical research, scientific papers, etc. Please don't use the same sentence more than once. Don't copy the same sentence from one section to the other. If you have a sentence that's in your abstract, don't use it again in your conclusion. You can get the same meaning across, but please don't verbatim copy sentences from one section to the other. It gets very boring for the reader. Don't use the same descriptive word in the same sentence. So I'll give some examples for some of the points I'm trying to make. So don't say a simple approach to solving this simple problem is. Say something more interesting. Say an innovative approach to solving this common problem is. You know, that's much more interesting, and it shows that you're not being lazy with your spelling or your grammar or the way you're constructing your sentences. Similarly, avoid kind of circular sentences. Just read through them, and we'll get to this, but read through your paper and see, can you write it better? Get someone else to see if they can make it more concise. Don't say things like, in order to determine if there was a difference in the two treatments, we used method X to see if there was any difference between the two. You see how we've come difference between the two twice now. You don't need to do that. You know, there are easier ways of writing the same thing. When it comes to grammar, or kind of the spelling, punctuation and grammar side of things, use your hyphens correctly. You realize that you can actually completely change the meaning of a phrase if you put a hyphen in the wrong place, or put an unintended hyphen there. For example, if you say disease hyphen causing poor nutrition, so disease causing poor nutrition, this means that poor nutrition is causing the disease. Otherwise, you can say disease causing poor nutrition without a hyphen, and this says the disease is causing the poor nutrition. So notice how the meaning changes completely just with putting one hyphen in there. And your grammar check on your software on Word may put a hyphen in and may get it wrong. So you just need to make sure you don't just blindly grammar check everything. When you're using plurals, use them correctly. Don't say in 8 patients a biopsy was performed. You can say biopsies were performed in 8 patients. It sounds a lot better and actually is fewer words. Don't mix your tenses when you're writing. So for example, you want to say the patient fills in a questionnaire and this was analyzed. So each patient fills in a questionnaire and this was analyzed. Half of that's in present tense, half of that's in past tense. It'd be better to write each patient filled in a questionnaire that was then analyzed. That would be much easier, and that would, it would make more sense because everything's in the same tense. And please write your paper in the same tense. Don't have some in different, don't have some in the present and some in the past. And if you're using past tenses, use the same past tense. Keep your sentences balanced. One of the things you could write is we measured the pain score in patients who received morphine and patients who received paracetamol. You've said the patients who received twice now. It's kind of basically your sentence has kind of got 2 halves to it, and you don't need to do it like that. Instead of that, you could say we measured the pain scores of patients receiving either morphine or paracetamol. You've got the same thing across, but you're not repeating yourself, you're not making the sentence too long and unbalanced. Keep your sentences short, and don't try and start with numbers, and use the active tense. So here's I've kind of come up with an example. I wrote this out myself from just a paper that I've made up off the top of my head. It doesn't really exist. You could say, so 431 patients who attended the ED with fractures were stabilized using SAM splints instead of plaster of Paris back slabs. Of these 431 patients, there was data available for analysis on 407 patients in order to assess the long-term fracture healing. It's waffly, it's long, the couple of long sentences in there, and everything is was this and was that and was that. So you're kind of using passive tenses here. You could say, much shorter, we treated 431 patients with fractures in the ED with SAM splints. There was data available on 407 patients in order to assess fracture healing. Done. Same thing, half the length, much clearer, much snappier, much easier to read. In terms of basic kind of grammar rules and things, don't use colloquial phrases, don't use kind of common kind of casual phrases like etc. and so on in scientific papers. If you're going to say etc., 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 and it's a long list of references, for example, quote every reference or give the references, put them in, when you're referencing, put the numbers in for your references, put the full list in. Don't say etc. or and so on and so forth, because it's quite a lazy way of writing, and these are formal papers, these are factual papers, it's non-fiction. You need to have, you need to be kind of thorough and not lazy with the way you're writing. If you want to use abbreviations in your papers, that's fine, and you will need to use abbreviations because sometimes you don't want to keep using long phrases again and again. The author's guide for the publication that you're looking to submit to will have a list of standard abbreviations used in the publication. If you have a standard list and you want to use those abbreviations, you can use them right from the beginning. You don't have to write out the long form and then the abbreviation in the bracket if it is a standard abbreviation commonly used in the publication. If you are using non-standard abbreviations, on the first use in the abstract and in the main text, you need to write the full phrase. Maybe the first couple of times you use it, probably no more than that. So when you're comparing patient satisfaction in general anesthesia with local anesthesia, the first time you write general anesthesia, put a GA there, and local anesthesia, LA there in brackets. Next time you use it, maybe use the long phrase again, but then afterwards you can keep referring to general anesthesia as GA and local anesthesia as LA, because you don't want, again, it saves on words, it's easier to read, but you need to make sure that your readers understand what those abbreviations are. When it comes to finding a title, there's an interesting, in this kind of media age that we're in, and the way we look at things and how in our kind of short attention spans, we're always looking for something snappy, something kind of clickbaity, and we all fall victim to clickbait. So in that sense, you can absolutely try and find a more snappy title for your paper. Go to someone in your department who's good at coming up with these things. I know at Tawam, I know Dr. J is pretty good at coming up with these in kind of short phrases and good, cool names for talks and things. So go to someone like him and ask him, what do you think we can do with this title? If your title of your paper is a randomized controlled trial of 431 patients who were treated with either plaster of Paris backslabs versus SAM splints in the emergency department, it's fine, it's factual, it's the kind of titles we're used to reading. If you see that and you're like, oh God, another randomized controlled trial, I don't really want to read it. On the other hand, if you say SAM splints are as good as backslabs in emergency fracture stabilization, okay, that's a phrase. I want you to back them up. Oh wait, you're going to back it up with a randomized controlled trial. Maybe I'll read that. Certainly I'd read the second paper more than the first paper, even though the papers are going to be the same. As we mentioned earlier, again, title, abstract, very, very important. Take special care over writing your abstract. There's a few mnemonics for writing abstracts. Again, I'm not going to go into that today, but your abstract is what will be seen in a search. Your abstract is what will be seen in a Google search as well. Sometimes people will find the abstract to your paper and be able to use some of the information from there, but they won't be able to access the full text, and this happens to us all the time. The abstract is what will be seen, what will be indexed, and the abstract is what people will remember. They won't remember the 7 pages of methodology and results that you've published. They'll remember, the half-page abstract that you published. So take special care over your abstract and get someone senior, experienced, good at English to read your abstract, to maybe even write your abstract. When it comes to submission, if you don't have clear guidelines from the author guidance on the publication you're submitting to, there's a few basic tips for readability. Use simple fonts, anything which is sans serif. Serif basically means, that's basically, if you look at the difference between this is without serif and this is with serifs. Serifs are these little bits that are added to the end of each kind of letter, which were primarily used in the olden days in fonts and gravestones, actually, I think is where it came up with, to kind of enhance legibility and to reduce kind of weathering over time. So basically use fonts which don't have all these additional flourishes on them. A font like Arial is pretty good. Colibri, which is kind of the default that I have on my PowerPoint. Verdana is another one. So just a basic, simple and easy to read font. When you're writing your paper for electronic submission, use 2 to 3 font sizes maximum. Maybe 1 for the title, 1 for the body, and 1 for any annotations that you're doing, and that's it. Don't use multiple different font sizes. It just gets difficult to read. And you want to maintain the interest of the reviewer and then the editor and then ultimately your readers. Avoid using bolds, italics, and underlined words. You shouldn't need to use these to make your point or to get a point across in a well-written paper. Your words should be able to make that, your words and your data should be able to make that point by themselves. When you're justifying, use a left justification as opposed to center justification or kind of an expanded justification. I'll give you an example here. And of course, one thing is use simple language and check your spellings. But just take this phrase from this hypothetical paper that I'd come up with. We treated 431 patients with fractures in the ED using SAM splints. There was data on 407 patients in order to assess fracture healing. We treated 431 patients with fractures, etc., etc. It's exactly the same sentence. One is easier to read, and I would say it's the second one because you're using a simpler font. You're avoiding getting people's eyes kind of stuck on italics and bolds and underlined words. It's not massively spaced. It's justified to the left, as most books are. It just makes things easier to read, okay? So I know which one I would rather read if I was reviewing a paper. When it comes to kind of writing the final sections, basically, make sure when you're doing your introduction and your discussion that you are referring to your references. That's the whole point of doing all your literature search and your review before you write your paper or before you even get started with your research. You have to refer to them in your introduction and discussion, and make sure you refer to as many of them as you can. When you come to kind of writing your discussion, obviously make sure you refer to the introduction and the results in your discussion, because the introduction is how you kind of got the idea and the results are what your work generated. Make sure you are referring to these in your discussion. It's nice to have a kind of an abstract discussion, but that's not the point of a scientific paper. It needs to be quick, to the point, discussing your results and why you did it. And then finally, when it comes down to it, end where you started. That's the easiest way for any kind of, for anything. When it comes to any books, art, fiction, non-fiction, everything should kind of end where you start. Your conclusion should bring you back to your introduction, which is why it's easier to sometimes write your conclusion and then go back and write your introduction, so that the two flow nicely together. And this brings it kind of closes the loop in the mind of the reader, and it makes it a much more pleasant article that's much more likely to be remembered. Once you've written your paper, just reread it multiple times. Kind of give it once you've put that final full stop and click save, just stop. Go away, have a cup of coffee, chill for a bit, do namaz, come back, and then kind of read your paper multiple times. Okay, read it, reread it, and then put it down. Make any edit it if you can, make any changes if you need to, and then put it away. Then give the paper to someone you know, who's probably a literate person, someone who can give you advice on kind of grammatical nuances. It doesn't obviously have to be someone who's very, very kind of experienced in scientific literature, although it helps. I have a cousin who is a journalist who's written articles for New York Times, has written articles that were published in Washington Post, as well as several places, several other kind of countries as well. She's incredibly literate. Fine, she's Americanized, so she has a slightly different way of spelling things, but she basically would be someone I would give the paper to read, and I've done so in the past, and she gives me a lot of good advice on kind of how to change things to get my point across slightly better. Once you've done all of that, put the paper away. Just put it away. You've done all the editing, you've done everything, put it away, give it a few days, don't think about it, and then come back and reread it again. And you may find, hang on, what was I saying there? It doesn't make any sense. Oh God, that's a horrible way of writing something. I need to change that. And you may come back and find you have different ideas about what you've written. So definitely kind of initially, after you've finished, give it a break, go back and reread it, edit it, put it away, a few days, get your mind on something else, and then come back and reread it before you even think about submitting it. That's all I'm going to say. Hopefully it wasn't too long. Just these three kind of references I want to kind of just point out to you. References and sources, essentially. The first one is a lovely 95 slide kind of PDF on how to write a world-class medical paper. It's very, very useful. It goes into a lot of detail, covers not only some of the points that I've made, but also covers a lot more detail about what you need to do for each section, how to write an introduction, how to write a method section, what formats to use, how to do graphics in a paper, and everything like that. It's a phenomenally useful site, and it comes from kind of the Elsevier side of things, so it's useful. We all from Elsevier is a medical publisher, which is very well respected and publishes a lot of journals, so it's a very good resource to use. Definitely go look at that. If you want a very quick 10-minute, excellent, really well kind of spoken, really well thought out and entertaining kind of video on how to write a medical research paper, Dr. Richard Villar, or Mr. Richard Villar, he's an orthopedic surgeon in the UK. He basically is an author. He writes kind of non-fiction and fiction. He also publishes a lot of papers. He's got a really nice, insightful, really entertaining 10-minute talk on how to write a medical research paper. So that's definitely something to have a look at. And then if you want a longer one from a gentleman called Dr. Michael Schatz, he works with the American Journal of, I think, Allergy. He basically has got a long, very detailed kind of YouTube talk on how to write a medical research paper, which covers a lot more depth about different sections, how to submit. Fine, a lot of it's based on the journal that he kind of edits for, but it gives you a lot of good ideas on do's and don'ts on when it comes to writing a medical research paper. Finally, I'd like to say thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk to you guys again. Hopefully it has been useful. I apologize that I'm not going to be around for the Q&As. I am on a much needed chunk of annual leave right now, and I'm hopefully lounging on a beach somewhere. In fact, if I'm not physically on a beach, I will be mentally on a beach somewhere, I promise you, with a kind of a mocktail and a little drink in my hand with one of those little umbrellas in there. So hopefully you've all had, it's been entertaining. If you have any questions for me, please do email me on mani.hussain@gmail.com. I'll be happy to answer any questions and give out any more advice if necessary. Again, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I wish you all the best. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mansoor, for this. I hope you are, in fact, enjoying your vacation. Such valuable tips and tricks on how to effectively write and construct a paper in a well-logical manner. And we can even carry these tips with us in the future when coming to write a paper, whether if it's a case report or a journal. So thank you so much. Up next, we have is Dr. Suneel, a returning champion on these EBM rounds and a well-known research guru. Dr. Suneel is an associate professor of emergency medicine and HEI, also known as Health Research Methods, Evidence and Impact at McMaster University. Also a founding member of the BEEM since 2005 and research lead for the EM researchers of Niagara and Niagara Research Campus of McMaster University Medical School. He works as a staff physician with Niagara Health Emergency Departments, as well as guidelines methodologist with the Canadian Association of Emergency Medicine and Society for Academic Emergency Medicine Guidelines for reasonable and appropriate care in the ED groups. So welcome back, Dr. Suneel.
Hello, welcome to the latest installment of the ECREM BEEM Evidence-Based Medicine Grand Rounds. This session is called Targeting Manuscripts for Publication. My name is Suneel Upadhye. I'm an emergency medicine physician at McMaster University, and I'm also associate faculty member of Health Research Methods, Evidence and Impact at McMaster as well. Our objectives for this session will be to provide an overview on successful writing tips, which my colleague will have just shared with you right now for the session. We'll also talk about targeting the right journal for your publications, how to avoid predatory journals, and finally, using checklists to make sure your manuscript is in the best shape possible for submission for publication. By way of disclosures, as previously, I'm a member of the BEEM faculty since inception in 2005 through current. I'm a methodologist with SAEM's GRACE groups using the grade processes, and I'm the research lead for the Emergency Medicine Researchers of Niagara. The core materials that we'll be presenting from today come from the Canadian Royal College Research Guide published in 2011, Chapter 29, and the CIHR Guidebook for New Investigators and various other references you'll see within the body of this presentation. So why do you want to publish your work? First of all, you've done a lot of work and you've hopefully achieved a great story at the end. So you should tell that story for the people who are interested and why it's so important to share. There's academic benefits for you in terms of credibility, visibility, promotion prospects within your university. It can help you get grants. It can help you with institutional brand and prestige if you're doing that work under the umbrella of a university or a research hospital. Finally, it delivers on your commitment to complete the trial work that you will have registered at the beginning of your project, if that's what you did, with randomized trials, systematic reviews with the appropriate databases, what have you. Most of all, we're in the business of improving patient care and quality of that care, and that's what you want to do with good research and telling your stories of how you improved so that others may share in your successes. There's a list of things you can think about with regards to preparing your manuscript that are listed here. First of all, is you want to have a useful outline for how you're going to lay out your manuscript and follow the author instructions on that. You want to choose your journal carefully and follow and read the guidelines for authors, and we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail following this. You want to tell your story. If you have pictures and graphics and tables and figures, you want to make sure they're carefully constructed and visually appealing to the reader. You want to have a good, strong title. You want to catch your reader with a good, catchy title so they don't get bored and move on. Your table of contents should have some graphics content as well. You're going to revise and edit and rework your manuscript over and over until you get it exactly where you want it to be so that you can submit and hope for the best chances of acceptance for publication. You should prepare the supporting information also appropriately, either within the body of the manuscript or in appendices or tables at the end of your manuscript. And you have to write a strong cover letter. We'll talk about this as well. So where do you get started with building the skills? So this was a good article by Gord Guyot and Brian Haynes here at McMaster in 2006 in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. So the summary of their things are here. And what we're going to talk about today is how do you choose the target journals and write for them, because every audience is different and every journal has different styles and formats that you have to adapt to. And how do you respond to reviewer comments and deal with the editors, again, to navigate how to get your submission successfully published. You have to choose a journal based on the audience that reads those journals. I mean, if you work in a specialized area, you're going to be speaking to a small group of specialized readers, and you should pick the journal accordingly based on what that audience likes to read. If you get rejected a number of times, you might want to aim lower for a lower profile journal based on impact factor or whatever else you're using as your determinants for your journal submissions. Ideally, you may choose a journal that has recently published on your topic, or you're building on work that's been published in that journal recently as well, because journals tend to like that if you reference and cite their previous work as well, because it builds up their citation impact factors. In your covering letter, you may want to suggest some reviewers who are sympathetic to your cause and likely to give you a good review and acceptance. And you may also want to advise your editors to avoid certain reviewers because they may be biased against you or disagree with you or any number of things. So suggest supporting good reviewers for you and discourage reviewers that'll be less supportive of you. That would be a good idea to put in your cover letter. So what are the steps to writing? Normally people think about, introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. In the CHR handbook, they suggest maybe you want to do these things out of sequence, and that's not a bad thing to think about. You might want to pre-program and pre-fill your tables and figures first, because they are the root of your entire story. And then you might want to format the results, describe the tables, figures, and other data. Don't do any discussion yet. Then you do the discussion, summarize the main findings, talk about your study findings in the context of the entire field, and perhaps ideally suggest a future research agenda. And then you can go back and do the introduction, say this is why this work is important in the grand context of life, and then get down to your research question quickly within about 3 paragraphs. You should be finishing up your introduction. Your abstract summarizes all of the above. It takes practice to write a good, catchy abstract, so again, that the reader doesn't look at it and just move on. And then finally, the methods. This has already been done anyway in your protocol development and during your REB approval. So it should be kind of a cut and paste activity so that you can just drop that in. And you don't have to follow this. You can write in various different ways and different styles to get the paper done, even at the beginning of your project, which is a smart idea. How do you write an effective discussion? The master of this is Ian Steele. He's a Canadian researcher who's responsible for all the big clinical decision rules that we use in emergency medicine. So he's talked about the 6 steps that he does, which is discuss the study results in text, not in numbers and figures, compare it to the previous work and talk about why this is more important, that it's building on that previous work, the strengths of your approach, the limitations of your study, if there are any, the clinical relevance of your work moving forward, and again, the overall conclusion. That's what Ian writes like. If you read his articles, they're always written the same way and they read very well. So he has started a brand new writing series in 2022. The first two installments of this are in the Canadian Journal of Emergency Medicine. So Guide to Writing and Publishing a Scientific Manuscript Parts 1 and Part 2 are available online if you want to read those. And it summarizes some of the stuff we're talking about today. Other writing tips, of all places, Twitter. So Dr. Gordon Guyatt, who is one of the god emperors of evidence-based medicine for the last 40, 50 years at McMaster University, he has started a series called Writing Tips on Twitter. So whenever I see these, I subscribe to his channel. And whenever I see these, I just download them and copy them and read them and try and figure out how to be a better writer, because he's a spectacular writer. He publishes 200 to 300 articles every couple of years. I mean, the guy's a machine, so he knows how to write. So it's worthwhile paying attention to him and other good writers as well. So other tips for good, efficient writing. If you want to take a writing course early in your career, that's a smart thing to do. You'll become a better writer right away, and then it'll increase your time efficiency and reduce the risk of rejections. With regards to the target journal, you have to know their publishing interests and the author instructions. If you're not sure, email them and ask them ahead of time to give them to you. You got to know your readers. Don't bore them to death with long poetic prose and all such. Be short, concise, and clear, and be impactful with your writing. Avoid any unnecessary language and words and sentences. It should be focused. Every sentence should contribute something. It shouldn't be just, like I said, flowery prose or pontificating about what it is that you're writing about and why it's so important. It should contribute something meaningful. If not, chop it out. You can pre-write the paper before starting the research, where you can write a full introduction, the methods, you can prepare empty data tables, and you can partially write your discussion in anticipation of a successful study or a failed study and say did or did not, and then you can adapt accordingly and get a lot of the writing work done early as you're about to launch a project. Finally, start strong. Every paragraph should have a catchy opening statement as to define what that paragraph is going to be on. Maybe 5 or 6 sentences per paragraph. Keep it short, keep it sweet, and tell the story quickly and get out. Other tips for good writing: you should probably be aware of the International Council of Journal Medical Editors requirements and reconcile that with the journal that you're going to submit to. They're going to be giving you your conflict of interest declarations as well, which you'll have to complete. Brevity is your friend. Short paragraphs, 5 sentences or less in each one to make your point, then move on and tell your story and get out. Avoid repetition. Nobody likes to read the same comments over and over at different points in the paper. It just feels like you're being browbeaten with the same point when you can say it once and then move on. Revise over and over. Internal review is not a bad idea. To recruit some of your colleagues or your contemporaries in your area to review your paper before you send it in for journal review and submission. And finally, write every day. Just to keep on schedule. It's a good idea to write even a few lines or a paragraph. It might take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, but it keeps you on your task, and it'll help you get to the end of your project faster when you're writing. I try to adhere to this with my various projects. Sometimes I'm successful, other times I'm not, but it's a good practice to undertake if you can. And copy other successful authors, the Gord Guyatts, the Ian Steeles, the Brian Rose, very many other great emergency medicine writers. You should look at their style of writing and try and emulate it best you can if you can discern the patterns of good writing out of that. So when it comes to submission, you have to have a publication plan. Ideally, you should have that sorted out which journals you're going to target at the development stage of your project. So have that list done a priori in terms, this is my number 1 journal, my number 2 journal, number 3, number 4, et cetera, et cetera. If it's a large study, you might consider doing multiple publications. So you have one grand master publication and then a bunch of sub-studies coming off that. A lot of successful programs do that. They pre-plan their authorships and they rotate them so the various participants can take turns being first author if they own a certain part of the study, and that's what their contribution is going to be. So many projects, many articles, many first authors, what have you. The 5 questions you want to think about when you're picking the right journal: who's your target audience? We've said this before. How do you want to reach them? Do they read print journals or electronic journals or other media? How will they access your journal, your article? Will they do so by prescription? Are you going to allow them open access or pay-per-view? What have you? Those are your choices. Is the right journal a general medical journal for the study you've done, or a specialty journal for something very focused and specific for a target audience you want to look at? And then finally, how soon do you publish the data? As soon as possible, whenever your study is done. You don't want the data to get stale and potentially become unpublishable because it's become out of date. Some commentaries to think about and some internal ideas to do. Clarify those names with those questions we saw. You can do checks with your coworkers and colleagues in your department to say if you're on the right track and adapt the goals for your publication as needed. And then when you start looking at your target journals, you can have a long list of potential candidates, and then you should hone that down through other processes, talking to people, looking at the publications those journals do, see how well it fits with your study that you are working on and completing, and then refine that list into something short and targeted. And then finally, if you pick your journal and then you look at the prior instructions that they've given you there, like I said, cut the journals that don't meet your needs and or you can't accomplish what you need to accomplish with them until you have a short list. Okay, so choosing the right journal, here's some considerations. I would always suggest going after index journals with PubMed or Simago, and if they have a higher impact factor, the better for you. They're easier to access to a global audience, and they do have some credibility assigned to journals that have indexing in these major repositories. Again, who's your target audience? Are they a generalized group? Are they a specialized group? And where do they read their articles? We've talked about this before. Do you want to keep the scope local, or do you want to speak to an international audience? Ideally, if you're doing studies that have broad generalizability and international panache, then you would want to put that in an international journal. Open line online access. Do you have the funds to pay open access journal fees? They can be expensive, so you have to build that into your research budget if that's your plan, to provide immediate open access, as opposed to embargoed copies that 6 months to a year later may become free access through institutional subscriptions. Language considerations. Generally, the big journals deal with English. It is the scientific language of the world, but there are other journals that will publish in other languages, so you have to think about that depending on your audience. The peer review quality. So do they have good peer reviewers, and how quickly do they get those turnaround times to you? It's frustrating when you've submitted a journal and you're waiting months and months and months for peer review, only to find out that it's revised with revision and resubmit or rejected or whatever. That should be happening very quickly, and certain journals do a good job of that in emergency medicine. The quality of the comments and the feedback from the reviewers is also important. You don't want to have just generic comments that don't give you useful information with regards to how to revise your manuscript, make it better, and hopefully resubmit to publication to that same journal. The publication time and frequency and lag time. So certain journals publish every month, others publish every 2 months, others cover quarterly, and so on and so forth. And then what is the lag time to get your article accepted and then published? You may want to think about that with your journal. If you want to get your story out there fast, you might want to pick a journal that publishes every month. And finally, there are different types of submissions within a journal. You may have categories called original research, brief scientific research that has a bit of a word limit, and tables and references and author limit. You might publish a research letter in a journal that allows you for such. So you just look at the author requirements for such, and if you can write according to those requirements and meet their requirements, then you could submit it as that article type to that journal. Tools online to find the right journal. There's these various tools called Find My Journal, Open Access Journal Finder, Think, Check, Submit, DOAJ I'm familiar with a little bit, Scopus also. I haven't gone through all of these various journal types just to see what these platforms can do and tell us who's a credible journal versus who's predatory. We'll talk about that later. And then you can filter your candidates accordingly using these types of tools. If you're still unsure about your target journal, call and ask. If you have in your head that there's a certain journal you want to go to, just send an email to the editor-in-chief and say, hi, Dr. So-and-so, we've done this work. I'm interested in publishing in your journal. Is this something your journal would be interested in? And if so, what would you suggest? And then take some advice and feedback from them, and they will help you out with that. And if they say, no, this is not the kind of work we publish in our journal, but we would suggest that you go to these journals, then go to the next ones that are suggested. So it'll save you some time. Direct communication just to open the door is never a bad idea. Writing an effective cover letter is critical. It's the entry point, it's the introduction of your work to the journal editors and to the board. You don't want to waste their time. You don't want to insult them. Make sure you spell their names right. Clearly articulate briefly and concisely what the study's purpose and importance is of your results. If you've had prior submissions and reviews from other journals, you can disclose that. You should definitely confirm REB waivers or allowances or permissions to do the work that you did. You adherence to good practice patterns, international good practices, standards and statements, and regulatory adherences. Adherence to ICJME conflict of interest disclosures. Every journal has those forms, so you'll have to submit those either at the beginning of the process or when you get accepted. Any prior presentations, posters, abstracts at conference and stuff like that, you should list them on your article and or some partial data releases that are published elsewhere. You can recommend appropriate reviewers and give them the contact information. Don't say, please contact these 4 doctors or these 4 reviewers, but don't don't ignore giving them the contact information, because you want to make the editor happy. You want to make their life easy. So make their life easy, give them up-to-date contact information. And then finally, if you have more simultaneous submissions elsewhere, if they're relevant, then you should probably disclose that as well. How does peer review work? So that's what's going to happen. You submit your journal to peer review, and then it goes to a bunch of reviewers within the black box of the journal, and a decision gets spit out: accept, revise and resubmit, or reject. So as in all things in life, you want to make a good first impression. Make the editor's job easy. So like I said before, if you have potential reviewers who are useful for your work and supportive, give them their names, give them their contact information. Consider reviewers to avoid. They may have conflicts of interest. They may have philosophical differences with your work. They may not like you. Any of these reasons, give them a list of people to avoid so that you don't end up shooting yourself in the foot and getting a rejection right out of hand. And follow the journal's author instructions meticulously. I can't emphasize that enough. If you don't follow the journal author's instructions, it shows two things. One, an inability to follow instructions, or two, an unwillingness to follow instructions, both of which are not helpful to get you your publication in that journal if that's what you want. So as peer review process goes, you just start here at the top. The articles get submitted. The journal editor may screen the paper and just reject them out of hand. If they're happy with them and think, yeah, let's put them on to reviewers, because you don't want to waste the reviewers' time either. They go to reviewers. The reviewers will either accept the journal, accept the articles, reject them out of hand, or they may send them back to the author with review comments and revisions to say, revise and resubmit. So those are the three outcomes you're going to see. Internal peer review, again, this is before you submit to the actual journal. You might want to share your paper with some colleagues and local supporters and get them to give you some feedback and writing tips and instructions and edit it because they're looking at it with an impartial third eye, and whereas you're too invested and can't see certain things that can be fixed. So you can circulate that amongst your peers and get comments, get revisions. Sometimes these activities are organized in various grant applications in different universities, especially in Canada, for example, for CIHR. We have to send them in for internal review before we let them go out to granting agencies and what have you. So it is a bit of a obstacle course to run, but it's worth doing it ahead of time internally with people who are sympathetic to your cause before you send it off to out into the world for reviewers and editors to look at and critique. Rejection. It happens. You should expect rejection because it's just, there's a lot of volume of paper that are going out there. And yeah, it hurts when you get it, but you have a few options of how to respond to a rejection. You can consider just saying, okay, forget that journal, move on to the next one on your list if it's appropriate for the article. You can contact the editor and respectfully ask about why they were rejected and ask if they resubmit with appropriate revisions from the reviewers, will they reconsider it? And hopefully that would give you a positive encouragement to fix your paper and do better. Get those a lot. And then consider every reviewer editor's comments if you're going to do that and fix the problem specifically that they were worried about and resubmit with a new submission. Okay. Even if you're going to send it to a new journal, it's a smart idea to take the previous journal's review our comments and fix those things before you send them off to the next journal, because the next journal may also send it back to you saying, well, we have these same problems, but you knew that because you didn't fix that from the first article. So fix those things before you send them along. Getting rejected is very easy, and you want to avoid those traps that get you rejected. So ignoring author guidelines and journal formatting, that's a no-brainer. That just shows you can't follow instructions. Writing unsupported conclusions, you shouldn't over-interpret and over-extrapolate on what your data actually shows. Spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, these are simple mistakes to avoid with spell checks and other readers doing that. Deficient study design, it's hard to save that at the end of a project if you did the entire study incorrectly or in a biased fashion. That will be a tough sell later. Sloppy tables and figures, easy to fix, so you should avoid those problems ahead of time. Don't make them cluttered, and there's online resources on how to do good figures and good tables and all such. Using outdated methods and skipping the details of certain things. Again, this is something that should have been fixed at the protocol development level at the beginning of your project, not at the end. You might not be able to salvage that. Overlooking the journal's aim and scope, that's again just poor preparation for screening the target journals you want and not knowing what they're interested and care about. A vague research motive, again, this is questions that are unclear, answered poorly, phrased poorly. We covered PICO questions earlier on in this series, so that's a preparations problem. Poor analytics is something that, again, with a good data analyst and or a statistician, you should be able to avoid that. And forgetting to cite important work from other people, that's problematic. So you got to be very clear with your lit reviews, and we've covered that in previous sessions as well, to make sure you've got all the up-to-date contemporary research and literature that's been published on your topic, so as not to overlook something important, because nothing's worse than a reviewer knowing about that literature base and then coming back at you say, but Smith et al. In this study disproved your entire thesis and your conclusions with a study that was methodologically perfect and the sample size was a lot bigger, and you have no comeback to that. So you want to avoid those things. Know your literature. When you respond to reviewers and editors, for reviewers, try to be agreeable with the reviewer's suggestions. And if you can't, try to disagree respectfully, flatter them if you need to, thank the reviewers for their assistance if they're giving you useful feedback, and then answer each criticism specifically and explicitly. Quote them back to themselves, and then answer their concerns specifically with direct quotes. And when those reviewers see those articles resubmitted and say, yes, they fixed this, I'm happy, let's move on to acceptance. With editors, give them exactly what they want. Make their lives easy, make a good first impression, follow all the rules, because if you make their lives difficult, they will reject you first because they've got another 50 manuscripts to look at that have done things better. So don't make life hard for yourself. You may do the pre-submission email or contact to see if the paper is appropriate, like we discussed before. And then finally, revise, reformat, resubmit until you're rewarded and with a appropriate acceptance. Checklist. This is pretty easy to understand, and these are available ubiquitously online. So the writing standards for how to write up certain study designs are available online. They've been well codified in international standards for many years now. So it depends on the study design you're using. If you're doing randomized control trials, you're supposed to report using the consort guidelines. If you're using systematic reviews and other review articles, you can use Prisma and the various other extensions for that, and so on and so forth. You can find all the appropriate updated writing standards for different study designs on the Equator Network's website. I'll show you that in a second. If you don't have a reporting standard for some reason on such, you could take critical appraisal tools and sort of retrofit them to your study to make sure that all the required elements for quality have been met there. You can also prospectively forward fit your study design checklist so that when you're planning and you're aware that consort is your required reporting standard at the end of your study, make sure that your protocol includes everything explicitly that's going to be needed to be reported using consort or Prisma or whatever. So that's, again, protecting the methodology and optimizing your process and your protocol before you even launch a study. So look at those lists ahead of time before you even get going with your work, because that's what you have to write to meet at the end. And follow the target journal's author instructions. I don't know how many times I can say this, but do that. Okay, here's the page from the Equator Network, as I mentioned before. And here are all the listings for the various study designs that you would need to be aware of. So randomized trials is consort, observational studies, strobe, Prisma for systematic reviews, STARD for diagnostic tests, Agree and Write for clinical practice guidelines, economic evaluations is Cheers, and Squire for quality improvement. Depending on what kind of projects you do, you should be aware of these checklists and write to them. Okay, your editors will be happy if you have ascribed and written your project in a concordance with these reporting standards. Okay, another summary checklist to look at in terms of how to write. Again, through the websites, we've said this before, familiarize yourself with target journals of interest, their writing requirements, their most popular articles, and make sure what you want to submit fits with what they want to publish. They have a target audience for the people who read their journals, and you should fit your study to that target audience as much as you can. Draft as much of your article as you can before you even start the research. I'm a big believer. You write your protocol and you pre-write your final article before you even launch, because then all you have to do is plug in your data, interpret it, finish your discussion, fill in your tables and charts, and then you're done. Okay. Review the requirements of your selected target journal. Follow the rules. Just do it, make yourself happy, make the editors and the reviewers happy. Share your drafts with pre-review if you want, for colleagues for their feedback and all such things, just before you submit your article, because then you make a stronger article before you submit it, and then revise and respond based on the comments that you hear from reviewers and editors, and then resubmit if you're entitled to do so. Let's wind up with some comments about predatory journals. This is a big problem in the world now. So predatory journals are a threat to scientific integrity worldwide. They tend to promise things like rapid review, turnaround time. They sometimes will guarantee you acceptance regardless of how good or bad your study is. There's generally no credible review processes that you can identify how they do it. There's no quality checks. They don't necessarily require ethics reviews for published articles. They sometimes don't have legitimate office addresses. So when you see their office address, and if you put it into Google Maps, one time I saw an empty lot with no building on it in New Jersey. They may have a false editorial board and experts, and they haven't asked these people to be on their editorial boards. They just go skimming through universities' faculty rosters and say, okay, this is an interesting name. It seems like a credible person. And they just throw those people's names on their website without their permission. They're not actually editors or reviewers. They may have high publication fees that are charged to authors. It may be difficult to extract your project if it's been accidentally published in one of these predatory journals and get it out and then put it in a legitimate journal. And then all the work you've done is essentially lost because you can't retrieve it. They are starting to penetrate into Web of Science, which is concerning, and other legitimate open access listings. So this is very dangerous. The guy who really got onto this and explored this dark black box is Jeffrey Beal, a librarian who used to work at the University of Colorado. He had what was called the Beals list and all such things. And, you know, there are false conferences out there that are doing this now, false editorial boards we've talked about. I get emails almost every day, almost every week, asking me to submit articles to journals that I've never heard of in areas that I'm not an expert in. This is an example of one I got just recently. And it's just nonsense. And I've learned to just go junk, 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 so as not to fall into the trap of submitting legitimate work that me and my coworkers have worked on into one of these garbage journals and never to see it again. So spelling errors will come in the invitations, rapid submission deadlines. I get stuff that's unrelated to any of the specialty work I do or any of my previous research. So I've learned to recognize that these are garbage invitations and I just get rid of them right away. So in Nature in 2019, they talked about checklists, the Beals list, the Cables list of predatory journals, and then how to detect some of those things and what's verified, or things on the directory of open access journals seems to be more reliable, but they're not perfect, okay? Another area that lists how to find up how to identify predatory journals is you can look at the Beals list or the Cables lists. If the website that you're submitting to just looks shoddy, if there's errors on there, the imagery is weird, the contact information is sketchy, all of these things should be warning signs, red flags to say, you know what, move on, skip that journal. It's probably suspect or predatory, and get rid of it and just move on, okay? There is research on predatory activity going on now worldwide out of the University of Ottawa's Ottawa Health Research Institute. They have a Center of Journalology, and this is Dr. David Moore, who is a very respected clinical epidemiologist and academician for many, many decades now. He founded this activity in Ottawa, and they do research on processes to check for predatory journals. They found that there's lots of different checklists out there. They're not necessarily evidence-based, and they are working on a universal checklist for detecting predatory journals. So you can go to their materials and see if there's tools on there to make sure that where you want to send it to is not in fact predatory and it is legitimate. So let's summarize. Writing your manuscript takes practice, collaboration, as you will have heard in the previous presentation, and possibly training to become a better writer. That's always a good thing to invest in early in your career. Targeting the right journal takes planning and preparation and pre-planning at the beginning of your project. We do this with all of our projects in Niagara. We say we're going to do this type of project or quality improvement project, and we already know the target journal in mind because we just know those journals and where we want to tell our stories. Following international reporting standards and reviewing the author submission guidelines. We know these cold as we're getting ready to plan our studies and as we write our manuscripts after those projects are done. Communicate early with the journal editors and respectfully to make sure you put in a good impression and you increase your chances of making their life easy and getting your article accepted, and how to avoid predatory journals. I had been trapped with this once with a coworker of mine in another specialty that I was collaborating on, and we got an article in a predatory journal, and it ended up being a waste of time. Luckily, it wasn't a big investment project, but I learned there never to do that again. So hopefully all of these activities will lead to you having a celebration of a successful submission and acceptance, and you should share that and disseminate that with your colleagues accordingly. Thank you very much for the presentation. We'll move on to the live session shortly, and we can answer any questions you want there. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Suneel, for that succinct guide to manuscript publication. I can't think of a better way to not only conclude our modules, but also guide all our future researchers on their final steps of the research journey. So that wraps up our lecture sessions, which means it's now time to move on to our live Q&A sessions. Unfortunately, Dr. Mansoor won't be able to join us this evening, but please do share any questions you have for him either via the chat box, and we will forward them over to him, or you can contact him directly over the previously mentioned email or contact details. And Dr. Suneel, thank you so much for being with us. And can I ask you kindly to switch on your mic and video for this part of the session? And your audience, please feel free to share any questions you have on the chat box about the questions discussed today or any of the previous modules that Dr. Suneel discussed with us, and we'll read them out to him. We have one question which we received earlier for Dr. Suneel.
I'm just saying that the host has stopped my video, so if somebody can turn me back on, that's great.
Yeah, sure. Just give us a moment, please.
Sure.
So how did you find the experience overall with, oh, we're good to go? Okay, great. Dr. Saeed, you're with us. Can you try switching on your video?
Yeah, I'm trying. It says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. Huh.
All right.
Let me try it again. Well, I can answer questions in the meantime, at least in
Sure.
the background.
Yeah.
I'll just keep trying here. Yep.
That's fine, no worries. So this question is actually from me when I was looking at your slides. So you talked about reporting guidelines, such as those provided by Equator Network, and how to use them to ensure that all the required elements are reported, either in the retrofitting module fashion or the forward-fitting fashion. So in your experience, is there one approach that's superior to the other? And if we do it in the retrograde or the retrofitting way, is there a way to ensure that you fulfill all elements? And if they don't fulfill it, how can we overcome that?
So it's important to know that a reporting checklist is not necessarily the same as a quality improvement or a critical appraisal instrument, right? So first and foremost, you just want to follow the instructions of the journals if they have them specifically. Because if let's say, for example, you do a randomized trial and the journal instructs the author, you must adhere to the consort statements or the consort reporting frameworks. So at the beginning of your project, you should be ideally planning to follow that as much as possible. And if you're doing the things like pre-writing your manuscript and your protocols kind of together, make sure that you just follow all the steps in the consort checklist, and you should increase your likelihood of success of writing a good manuscript and then getting it published. You will also, you can even say in your methods section somewhere at the end, we followed the consort guidance steps for creating a randomized trial. If you're doing a systematic review, you could say we followed the PRISMA methods of doing a systematic review, a scoping review, or whatever the case it is. And that would sort of solve that problem, and it would keep the journal editors and everything happy.
Right.
And look, keeping reviewers and editors happy is the key to success. Like with a good first impression is everything. Think about any job interview you've had, or dating and mating prospects, or whatever it is. Like we're all trying to make good first impressions on anything we do with anybody we're trying to engage with if we want something from them. And from the journal editors and reviewers, we want an acceptance. So keep them happy, follow the rules. Like we said, not following rules is either inability or unwillingness to follow rules, or ability to, that's not reassuring to the reviewers and journals. So the reporting standards issue is one thing. And you don't have to do this exercise at the end of your manuscript, but if you also want to run it through one of the critical appraisal instruments. So let's pretend you did a literature review and you followed the PRISMA guidelines and PRISMA statements for reporting, study design, and all such things. Now there's a different tool out there for systematic reviews for critical appraisal, called AmStar. Don't ask me to remember what it actually stands for, right? Or AmStar 2, I think, is the latest version. So you can do like a little trustworthiness quality check. You don't have to include that comment in your manuscript if you don't want to. That you double check. So Prisma, for example, defined all of your steps and standards from the beginning prospectively. And I mean, you can do a Prisma check again retrospectively to see if you did everything right, or you could use AmStar as well to say, okay, did I do everything? Because the two of them align quite well, right? Now, in other study designs, there may not be a critical appraisal tool to double check the quality of your work, and then you have to just stick to the reporting guidelines. But a statement like that, for example, would be, let's say in Consort, there's a little item that suggests, the patients various people were properly blinded in a double-blind randomized controlled trial, right? Or whatever it is, right? So you can write something in your manuscript that said blinding was done for these various groups, but in a critical appraisal assessment, you'd be looking at, well, was the blinding done well? Was it done properly? Were enough people blinded and all such things? So the reporting standard may not comment to that, but the quality approval, the critical appraisal instrument may address that more deeply. So that's where the two types of checklists can be complementary to each other. But at the very minimum, you should follow the reporting standards of the study design that you have written, whether you planned to that design or not.
Yeah, and like you said, and the whole point of this module is just to make sure that you're following some sort of guideline, and at the end of the day, it's to get your paper published and to get reviewers and editors so that everybody's speaking the same language, basically. So thank you for your answer.
You want to inspire confidence and trust in what you're giving them to say, yes, you should have faith that what I'm writing here and what we've done is in fact the truth, and therefore you should publish it and share that story with the clinical world, right?
Exactly. That's it. All right, I think Maitha is going to ask her next question.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much, Dr. Suneel, for that insight. Just one more question. One of the factors basically when considering a journal, as you mentioned in your lecture, the article processing charge, or sometimes the open access fee, which is of course ideal, but commonly a hefty sum of money. So it makes sense to think about what is reasonable based on your own personal scope and your preference and resources. But occasionally there are times where such fees are covered by the researcher's respective institutions. So for emergency physicians who are unsure on where this is applicable, what is the best course of your opinion, or rather, let's say the best way to approach an institution to request such coverage or eligibility for coverage of publication costs?
That's a great question. So again, all of this comes at the pre-planning stage in my mind. If you've gone through the exercise of listing your target journals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you've seen the author guidelines, and that's fine, you've accepted those. And somewhere in the same tabs, there's going to be something on what the publication process looks like. And that should include information about whether or not you want to fast track your manuscript to the world by paying an immediate open access journal fee. I mean, look, journals are businesses, right? I mean, they're in the enterprise of conducting business and making some money perhaps for the organization that produces them and all such. And they need to cover their costs, right? Their costs of producing journals, whether they're digital or paper or whatever they are. So they have to cover those. So during the pre-planning stage, when you've looked at your target journals, if they charge an OAJ fee, like an open access journal fee, then build it into your budget. If you have a budget that you're submitting for a grant or an award, or perhaps some other funding source, just build it in, okay? And if your funding agency and or your grants allows for that, then make sure you put that in. Like if it's $1,500, $2,000, 1,300 pounds, or whatever journal you're going to, and whatever unit of payment, your currency they're using, then build that in. Ideally, if you're lucky, you should build in dissemination costs to go to a conference. So somebody should be allowed to go to a conference, a registration fee, some travel fees, and a couple nights at a hotel. You can put those things as well. The worst thing to happen is your funding agency will say no. right? Second to getting external monies from your granting agencies or other funding bodies, charitable organizations, whoever you're going to call, is if your own institution does keep a fund for such things, and the more advanced emergency department programs, emergency research programs, departments who have, a more sophisticated, well-developed operational infrastructure, they keep slush funds around for funding, and they build that into their grants anyway. So the assumption is that when the project or projects get finished, there will be a cost to publishing them because they want that information out there fast. Right now, if you don't want to do that or you can't afford it, you can just submit it under some regular stream per se, not an open access, rapid access stream. You may not have to pay anything at that point, but then the only people who can read that article is the people who subscribe to the journal, pay a membership to the organization or the journal itself. Institutions that allow you access to a journal, like your universities, like I have McMaster University library access, you all have from your respective universities. So they're the only people who get to see that, at least for maybe 6 months to 6 to 12 months under the quote unquote embargo period. So what you're buying with your open access journal fee is freedom from the embargo period so that everybody in the world can see it right away, whether they have journal subscriptions or institutional access or not. That's what you're buying. So, and if you care that much and you're that committed and passionate about your work, if you have multiple authors, especially staff people, I would never put this on a resident, but if you have staff people who are like 3 or 4 of them collaborating, let them all pay, right? Like, if I have to pay $2,000 for an article that I'm co-authoring, but I've got 4 or 5 other staff people involved, then we're talking about $300 or $400. Like, what? Let's just pay the money, give the access to the world. It's a business expense on my taxes anyway. Canada, we pay a lot of taxes. In the UAE, I don't think you pay any taxes. That's fine. But there's a motivation for that as well. And then that's the opportunity cost for me to do this research and or get the research out to the world if I'm that committed to getting our story out there. In the grand scheme of life, what's $300 or $500, like whatever that number is, right? But ideally, if I don't have to pay it, I don't want to pay it. If somebody else will pay it for me, or we could figure out some other way, that's a good idea too. Free is better than not free. So,
absolutely. I mean, if we're really passionate about our work and we really did actually put a lot of effort in it, and we definitely want to publish it in some place worth it, then a few bucks just doesn't make that much difference.
Think about it this way as well, which is how many hours of your work, of your life, have you put into this project? And what is your hour worth from your salary perspective, or if you're a staff person from a clinical earnings perspective? Like the publication fee at the end of doing a project that took at least a few hundred hours of your life, if you were actually paid for that, that fee at the end is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket, right? So it's a perspective issue.
True. I completely agree. You're right.
Yep.
So that brings us, unfortunately, to the end of our Module 7 of the Research Workplan. Thank you for the speakers, Dr. Suneel and Dr. Mansoor, for the 2 awesome lectures. Thank you all to the audience and participants who took time and joined in today. Watch your emails. You will be receiving a link to fill in the feedback form in order to be able to collect your CME certificates.
On behalf of the entire team here at ECREM, I'd like to thank both our speakers, Dr. Mansoor in absentia and Dr. Suneel. Thank you so much for joining us and for all your valued contributions to this academic initiative. Thanks, Anzal, our host, for all your background work. And thank you to each and every member of the audience for your participation. We'll see you all soon for Module 8 of the Research Workplan, which is the grand finale. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you soon.
Okay, bye all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.